Thank you all for joining me here today. Before I start, I would like to inform the audience that I will be using uncomfortable language during this presentation. I used the original wording in order to preserve historical accuracy and to not alter the intention of the writers or the impact on the listeners. In the summer of 2020, the world was well into the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the US, there were social justice protests and counter protests of both peaceful and violent natures. It is during this time that I came across a heated debate on the Facebook Trombone Pedagogy group concerning Douglas Yo's article about Lassus Trombone by Henry Fillmore. Mr. Yo proposed that the trombone community should discontinue the use of Lassus trombone due to its overtly racist origin. Because there are other works that do not rely on racist underpinnings and provide analogous musical material, I support Yo's assertion that Lassus trombone should no longer be played or held in such high esteem. Let me first get to some counterarguments out of the way. The first is concerning cancel culture. The phrase cancel culture is already laden with negative baggage. Name calling is an attempt at deflection from having difficult conversations. I present this topic because I believe it is important to the healing of race relations in this country, and presenting this difficult subject is one way that I can have an influence in my sphere. I understand some people may not enjoy the topic, but slinging inflammatory epithets will simply not solve any problems. Secondly, some people may turn to whataboutism, which seems to be pretty popular the last few years. What about Wagner, or Arthur Pryor, or Stephen Foster, or? This argument is also an attempt at deflection. It is true that Wagner is problematic, to put it politely. However, the scope of this presentation is on Fillmore's Lassus. A conversation concerning Wagner, as well as others, is certainly one that should be had, but it falls outside the scope of this presentation. Moving on. There's already been much written concerning African Americans in American culture. These writings can focus on a wide variety of topics, including the downplaying of racism to overt racism by demonization or caricaturization, among other things. In his article, Whitewashing Blackface Minstrelsy in American College Textbooks, author Joseph Bird writes, quote, "Yet today, many textbooks on American music treat minstrelsy as almost a footnote. When they do discuss it, they restrict it to small pre-1860s shows, often sweeping it under the rug of the Civil War, and they say nothing whatever of the huge popularity of sheet music editions of minstrel songs, nor, of course, of the lingering racism that colored the rest of the 19th century and beyond." End quote. To give you a little bit more historical context, this presentation deals with the confluence of a few aspects of American history. One, the minstrel shows were hugely popular in the late 19th century and even the early 20th century. I suspect that they were popular because on one hand they made quote-unquote black music and themes, more on that later, accessible to middle-class white America, which was otherwise forbidden fruit, while also making the use of the worst African American stereotypes. Two, ragtime music. The chronology runs somewhat parallel to the emergence and popularity of ragtime music, which would begin in the South and become hugely popular in the United States via published music and eventually recorded music. 3. Sheet music publishers. It was a business after all. 4. Racism, of course, which has been at this country's core since the beginning. These four things come together to create the environment that was perfect for the publication of Lassus Trombone. In the widely acclaimed biography of Fillmore, Hallelujah Trombone, author Paul Byerly does not mention a word about the racist tropes used when he first mentions Fillmore's trombone family. Later, Byerly includes the 7 Nigga Smears advertisement with the following caption, quote, "Advertisements of this nature, unthinkable in today's society, were commonplace in the early 1900s. The minstrel character was the logo of the Fillmore Brothers Company and depicted a white comedian with makeup in typical minstrel attire." End quote. Byerly goes on to write, quote, "Each smear was dedicated to a stereotyped minstrel type person, and on the sheet music covers were caricatures of minstrel people, not real Negroes. Henry would never have permitted this type of display if he thought anyone would be offended. The smears were even called nigger smears because this terminology was in common use at the time. End quote. This kind of sanitizing of a truly corrosive ideology, despite how ubiquitous it may have been, is littered throughout Byerly's biography of Fillmore. It can be understood that this kind of ideology was likely commonplace in Fillmore's sphere, but it was never benign to those on the receiving end of that treatment. I cannot pretend to know what was in Fillmore's heart. Perhaps Byerly is right in saying that Fillmore did not mean to offend anyone. At the very least, we can say that this kind of imagery and language have no place in today's society. Another apologist is Michael Campbell, who writes, quote, "The minstrel show had introduced vernacular speech into popular music by way of the exaggerated dialect of the endmen's song. The use of dialect declined in the minstrel song as the century progressed. In most turn-of-the-century coon songs, dialect is relatively mild. For example, the use of dis and dat, or non-existent." End quote. Byerly is correct in saying that this kind of imagery and language were commonplace at that time in history. However, Campbell's statement is demonstrably false. Hundreds, if not thousands, of titles with stereotypical language and imagery can be found from that era, and it was by no means limited to brass literature. This slide shows just two examples of racist imagery that I've easily found in the MSU library. Interestingly, Lamont writes, quote, that the minstrel show was neither about authentic black life nor about an authentic South, end quote. He goes on, quote, "The blackface performance was a fantasy of northern white performers, largely middle-class homes, who knew little or nothing of black life," end quote. Despite the unfamiliarity of black lives by northern middle-class whites, quote, "black males were problematic to whites, especially to white men on many levels. Thus, they were the primary targets of severe mockery and theatrical stage caricatures. Minstrel show creators worked diligently to portray black males as predatory and dangerous, but at the same time socially and intellectually deficient and physically impotent," end quote. To draw a contemporary comparison, today's boogeyman is the immigrant who comes to this country to live off your tax dollars in the form of welfare checks, while at the same time taking your jobs. Another notable personality in the brass world also made use of racist ideas. A Coon Band by Arthur Pryor is one of the many compositions that is clearly and undoubtedly racist in imagery and content. Notice the juxtaposition of the goddess-like Euro-American women at the bottom, in contrast to the five buffoonish African Americans above. Unlike Lassus Trombone, where everything surrounding the music, but not the music itself, has racist underpinnings, Pryor's composition has racism as its central and overwhelming idea. Interestingly, I have found two versions of this composition. The instrumental publication's subtitle is simply Cakewalk Two-Step, while the vocal publication has the subtitle, Or the Tune That Won the Ham for the Coon Band. First, the instrumental version. I have not been able to locate a recording of the vocal version, but I did locate a piano score. The music of the two versions is related, but they are by no means simply the same piece with added words. The verses are built from new material, but the refrains of the vocal version are the same as the trio section of the instrumental version. On your left side, you will see the instrumental version, and on the right side is the vocal version. On the instrumental version, you may start comparing the first system fifth measure to the first system second measure of the vocal version. They are nearly identical down to the trombone solo indication. I do not know which version was published first. I can only speculate the vocal version came later. Perhaps the trio section of the instrumental version was the most popular part of the song, and Pryor decided to write a vocal version using that section as the repeating refrain. Again, I only speculate on this. Here are the lyrics from the vocal publication. I will give you a few seconds to review the lyrics and highlight some of the problematic lyrics on the next slide. In this slide, I've highlighted the most flagrantly problematic lyrics. In the first verse, when the first band played, all the judges said away, for half those coons could not read notes at sight. In the refrain, oh, ain't that flat, please give me a bat. In the second verse, a great big coon was the leader of that band, and all those black gals knew that he was gay. He played trombone, and he never had a home, for he blowed so much he blew it all away. You could hear him play on that old rusty pipe. The second refrain repeats from the earlier, oh, ain't that flat, please give me a bat. In the third verse, and he laid for Mr. Coon with that trombone. There was just one shot, and it must have hit the spot, for Mr. Nigger never played no more, and they buried him like they do all sporty coons. In the final refrain, the words are different from earlier. Oh, ain't that queer, please give me a beer. And every night at 12, a ghost cake walk takes place. I believe I can proceed without delving into why these excerpts are abhorrent. Arthur Pryor is perhaps the most famous American trombone soloist of all time. He certainly was the most famous of his time. He was the trombone soloist for John Philip Sousa's famous band and later formed his own band. Today, this work is lesser known, but I include it to exhibit the clear racist language and imagery used. In light of the context that Pryor was the preeminent trombone soloist in the U.S., it would be fair to assume that anything with his name on it would be a reasonably good seller. Using racist imagery and language on the cover and body of this composition is gratuitous in that it was likely not necessary to sell the product. It exhibits the comfort that the publishers and intended audience had with such language and imagery, and thus ideology. Other titles by Pryor include Darky's Dream, The Minstrel Band, Who Dat Say Chicken in Dis Crowd. Unfortunately, there has been painfully little written concerning racism and brass literature, specifically trombone. Fortunately, Douglas Yo, retired bass trombonist of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and respected brass historian, penned an eye-opening essay on his blog concerning racism and Henry Fillmore's Lassus Trombone. The composition occupies a special place in the American trombone canon. It is simultaneously viewed as a lighthearted piece as well as an expression of Americana in a canon that is thoroughly dominated by European music. It is both trivial and respected.
Playing a number which has long been a band concert favorite, Lassus Trombone. Gentlemen, a 1 and 2 and... Very, very excellent, boys.
Additionally, it is an accessible window through which classically trained trombonists can peek into the world of ragtime and early jazz music without the cumbersome weight for classical trombonists of improvisation, which is a requisite for modern day jazz trombonists. I present a recording of Lassus from 1919 by Dabney's Band. This is the second oldest recording of Lassus available today. I present this recording because of the superior performance than the older recording by Prince's Band of 1918. Douglas Yo's essay in the summer of 2020 sparked lively debate in online forums. I came upon one of these debates on the Facebook Trombone Pedagogy Forum. When I discovered the debate, it had already been going on for some days, and there were heated voices on both sides of the argument, as is typical of these online forums. There had been the typical ad hominem attacks, as well as those lamenting that politics had infiltrated this group, which had, up to this point, remained solely about trombone pedagogy. Within all the noise, there were people engaging in honest debate concerning the merits or shortcomings of Yo's position. Some argued that at this point, the vast majority of people had no clue of the racist materials associated with Lassus Trombone, and that Yo's essay only served to expose a whole new generation to those hurtful images and words, while others argued that it is high time that this kind of debate be had in the trombone community. It's with this background that I went to Yo's blog in search of his essay. Douglas Yo's essay indeed exhibits the many ways in which Fillmore used negative racist stereotypes to promote his music. On your screen is the aforementioned advertisement, 7 Nigga Smears. As we can see in the included graphic, there are descriptions of some of the included works written in what Campbell refers to as exaggerated African American vernacular, which is phonetically spelled. Note the difference between colored and colored in the descriptions. One could naively see this as an attempt to add some sense of authenticity. However, even if we accept Byerly's claim that the figure is a caricatured white minstrel, then we could extrapolate that the phonetic spelling of the vernacular is also a caricature of the real thing. Furthermore, minstrelsy operated on the foundation that Euro-Americans were painted in blackface, or makeup, as Byerly so nicely puts it, while portraying African Americans with the most exaggerated negative stereotypes of the time. In this light, we can interpret this advertisement as wholeheartedly displaying a disdain for African Americans. In this advertisement, Slim Trombone, it is much more difficult to claim that the figure shown is a caricature of a white minstrel. It is safe to say that the figure shown is a caricature of an African American man. Albeit well dressed, as he is a city dweller per the included description, his proportions are quite distorted. This, in itself, could be overlooked as most caricatures are typically misproportioned and not necessarily negative. However, the text attached clearly plays on the negative stereotypes, down to the implication that some of the Trombone family are criminals. Quote, Sally Possum, Lassus, Teddy, and Miss Trombone are doing duty with Uncle Sam and his allies in every department of service, interned in prison camps, and still amusing the folks at home. End quote. One could read that as if these four members of the family were in prisoner of war camps abroad during World War I, except for two details. One, women were not allowed to serve at that time, and two, the last line implies that the quartet is still able to amuse the folks at home. Despite all these clear indications that stereotypes were intentionally used in everything from covers to advertising to names, we must also ask ourselves if the music itself is inherently racist. If we're strictly speaking about the dots and lines on the page, then we must admit that they're not inherently racist. There are no lyrics for Lassus Trombone to point to. What is the word Lassus anyway? According to the dictionaries I looked up, it has something to do either with a Flemish composer of the late Renaissance or meaning weary, faint, or tired. I suspect it's the latter. Maybe it even has something to do with molasses. However, I suspect most people are not aware what the word Lassus means. Then the next logical question is, as many have asked, why not then play the music now that the racist tropes are no longer used? However, that's like asking, is it still racist if you take out the racism? Unfortunately, that's not the way it played out in reality. The racism was very much present when Lassus Trombone was published and remained in place for decades after that. Some argue that most people today are not aware of the racist past. While it may be true that there are many people that do not currently know about the racist past, there are many that do, more so now that Mr. Yob has brought it to light. Moreover, the racist beginnings of this tune are now very easily accessible thanks to the internet. I interviewed three prominent trombonists about Lassus Trombone: James Miller, John Lofton, and Kenneth Tompkins. James Miller is the Associate Principal Trombone of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and the Adjunct Professor of Trombone at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He grew up in middle-class Iowa, is currently in his 50s, and is Euro-American. He first encountered Lassus Trombone in junior high school and has run into this many times during his young years and as an adult, but did not know of its racist origins until he read Yo's article. In his experience, he never saw anyone mention the racist past of this tune. Despite that, now knowing its origin, he will not perform nor program this composition. Mr. Miller believes that there is nothing compelling enough about the composition to make it worthy of ignoring the racist past it so heavily relied upon. John Lofton is the bass trombonist of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and adjunct professor of trombone at California State University, Long Beach. Mr. Lofton grew up in urban Philadelphia, is currently in his 60s, and is African American. He had a similar experience as Mr. Miller in that he encountered this tune many times since he was young, but didn't know of its racist past until reading Yo's essay. In light of now knowing this, he also says he will not perform nor program Lassus Trombone in the future. Mr. Lofton's response comes from a place of first-hand knowledge of what racism can do to a person. During our conversation, he shared stories of how racism has touched his life in different ways, from how grade school teachers and peers treated him as less than, to later losing professional auditions. He is of the mind that we should do everything possible to not celebrate any form of racist ideology, no matter how far removed it may be. He currently plays a prominent role in the Los Angeles Philharmonic's Resident Fellows Training Program, which is, quote, an excellence-based training program for superb early career symphonic musicians representing or serving historically underrepresented populations, end quote. John relayed to me many stories while we were talking, and just to give you a little context of where he's coming from, he told me that he was, if not the first, one of the first classes that was bused from his side of town, the black side of town, to the white side of town for integration, and that experience was eye-opening for him. That most people were fine, but there was definitely a large part of the teaching faculty as well as students that treated him poorly simply because he was black, and those experiences shaped some of his view on life and race relations in this country. Later on, he told me about stories that he believes were opportunities that were lost because, again, he is black, he's African American, and those people in power did not want to give him the opportunity simply based on the color of his skin. So I can relate to some of those stories. While they may not have been as acute as his, I can definitely relate, which I'll get to later. Kenneth Tompkins is the principal trombone of the Detroit Symphony. He grew up in middle-class Maryland, is currently in his 50s, and is African American. Mr. Tompkins also first ran across Lassus early in his musical life. However, unlike many others, it was brought to his attention sometime in high school or early college that Lassus relied heavily on racist tropes. In telling me the story, he admitted to not thinking much of it at the time, likely because he was young and was simply thinking about his immediate responsibility of playing at the moment. After asking him why he didn't have a stronger reaction to finding out about Lassus's racism, he mentioned something that resonated with me because of similar experiences I have had. He said, I'm paraphrasing, when you're playing, you have a job to do. You can't attend to every racist thing you see. If you do, your energy and attention are split up and you can't attend to your job, which is playing. It's important to call out injustice, but you have to be effective when you do it. He admitted that now that he is older, more experienced, and in a stable career position, he thinks differently about the piece and his reaction. He firmly believes that Lassus should not be played any longer, with plenty of other literature from the time that doesn't have racist stigma attached to it. We no longer have to endure prolonging the racist tropes attached to Lassus. Mr. Tompkins made an interesting and pertinent comment later on in our conversation. He said, again I'm paraphrasing, racism is like a drone that follows you everywhere. Sometimes you hear it loud and clear, and other times it's barely audible, but it's always there. I also have experiences that are similar to Mr. Tompkins and Mr. Lofton. Some relate to music and some don't. Just quickly thinking of a few that do relate to music. I was hired for a big band show at a restaurant or a club, and between our setup and then our show, we were given a green room and dinner. And waiters were running, in and out, back and forth, bringing food and whatnot. And at one point, I crossed paths with the band leader, and he stopped me and asked me to get his table more utensils and more napkins. And I was confused at why he would ask me to do these things, and I think he was confused at my confusion. Till finally, the person standing next to him, who was the contractor, whispered in his ear, "Hey, this he's not a waiter, he's one of the musicians. So for those that don't know, many of the waiters, most of the waiters in Southern California are Hispanic, like myself. So the band leader thought that I was a waiter simply based on what I look like, which was not a malicious action, I'm sure, but just goes to show at the prejudices that we all carry, however benign they may be, and that affected me. I was a musician in his band, and he didn't even know that. Um, Another instance was I was playing an orchestra gig at a very expensive hotel in Beverly Hills, and we were all dressed in tuxedos. And during one of the breaks, I was in the hallway just outside the venue, but still inside the hotel, um, talking with another musician who happened to be white. And at one point, one of the patrons, one of the hotel guests, came up to me and asked me if I can get her car from the valet or something like that. And I was completely confused until I realized, oh, she thinks I work here. But why did she ask me, the Hispanic guy, and not the white guy standing right next to me, whom I was speaking to? So again, this person, I'm sure, or at least I assume, because I don't know the person, was not being malicious, but clearly carried a prejudice that the Hispanic guy worked as a valet and would be able to get her car, and somehow didn't think that the white guy standing next to me would be able to or work there or something, but was clearly inspired to talk to me rather than the other guy. And I've had many experiences like this throughout the years that luckily in my case, most were, I think, not malicious and mostly benign, yet, they did affect me. I can't imagine what it would have been like, in generations and places before me where there was definite malicious intent. And of course, there still are those people that carry malicious intent, but hopefully less so than before. To get back to Lassus and touch on first impressions, here was my first impression of Lassus. This was recorded and released in 1959, and these are two of the many album covers that it was released with. I heard it circa 1993 and couldn't believe trombones could play like this. The soloist is Frank Rosolino. I've heard this track at least a few hundred times in my lifetime. It changed the way I understood my instrument. I still admire it despite what I know about the origins of the song. I'm a perfect example of how difficult it is to change deeply ingrained habits, beliefs, and emotions. However, despite my admiration for that recording, I assert that Lassus Trombone should cease to be performed, or at the very least, it should be performed with appropriate historical context, lest we continue to perpetuate the hateful ideas first attached to the piece. What then can we, with our modern sensibilities, perform without fear of perpetuating such a vicious ideology? Finding published works from this era that are undoubtedly free from problematic connections has proven difficult to find, but not impossible. Chris Sorensen Jr.'s composition, Serio Comique, Trombone Sneeze, is certainly a piece that can and should be used to fill the same role as Lassus. To date, I have not found any publications with questionable material associated with this composition. Standing tall in this field is Nathaniel Davis, and it turns out he has his own trombone family. These pieces were not published together initially, but the subtitles to each piece indicate that they are indeed a trombone family. Oh Slip It Man from 1916, trombone novelty. Mr. Trombonology from 1917, a characteristic trombone smear, the son of Oh Slip It Man. Incidentally, Tommy Dorsey had a famous tune named Trombonology. One can only wonder if there was some cross-pollination. Miss Trombonism from 1918, a slippery tune, the granddaughter of Oh Slip It Man and daughter of Mr. Trombonology. Master Trombone from 1919, no subtitle. Trombone Français from 1921, trombone novelty. The first three pieces are clearly a fictional family spanning 3 generations. Master Trombone has no subtitle but could be a fourth member of the fictional family. If not, then at least a member of a series of trombone compositions. Lastly, Trombone Français is likely not a fictional person but can be admitted into the family of trombonistic works. Trombone Français was written after Davis's wartime service in France with the U.S. Army's 368th Regiment from 1918 to 1919. Unfortunately, I have not been able to locate recordings of the original orchestrations. I will now play a recording from 2017 by the Picherine Ragtime Society Orchestra. This is not the original orchestration, but it is very close. Regardless, it does give us an excellent representation of the composition. Next, I will play Mr. Trombonology, recorded at the 2020 Midwest Clinic by Weston Sprott of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, accompanied by the U.S. Navy Band. Mr. Sprott is also the Dean of the Preparatory Division at the Juilliard School and is well known for his social justice advocacy. He also visited and gave a masterclass here at MSU in the before COVID times that I was privileged to attend and play for. Mr. Davis's and Mr. Sorensen's works show that there do exist compositions in the same style and are contemporary to Lassus Trombone that do not use racist tropes in any way. Moreover, Nathaniel Davis was a successful African American musician and composer who is unfortunately not well known today. These pieces were originally published individually. Sadly, many would later be published by Carl Fisher Publishing, which bought Fillmore Brothers Publishing and was also not afraid to use racist tropes in its publications. One could make the mistake of assuming this use of racist imagery and language was a one-off, but both Fillmore and Fisher show a long habit of using such materials for their publications. Later, we will see some examples of how Fillmore and Fisher were not hesitant to use racist imagery or language. Here we see an advertisement from Davis's own company from May 5th, 1917. It carries no hint of racist language or imagery. In this ad from Fisher's Musical Messenger, their own monthly magazine/catalog publication from May 1921, we see that subtitles or commentary have been added or altered from the originals. Master Trombone is now a loner and happy to be one. In the Jungle is worser and worser. Oh, Slip It Man is now awful, and Mr. Trombonology is now a fool. Pryor's Kanane Balmo has something to do with Darkest Africa. It is clear that Carl Fisher was comfortable with negative portrayals of African Americans. Carl Fisher would go on to publish Mr. Trombonology along with other compositions with racist titles, such as Africana and In the Jungle. In The Wizard, Trombone Jazzer by M.L. Lake in 1919. As noted before, Fisher was okay with adding racist subtitles and descriptions. Obviously, the words Africana and In the Jungle are not inherently racist, but when attached to music associated with African Americans, it is difficult to deny the intended effect. Moreover, you will notice that below Mr. Trombonology, there appears another unnamed composition by Davis. Fisher did not even bother to title Davis's piece, which turns out to be "Oh Slip It Man," the first in Davis's trombone family. By listening to all these works I've presented in such close proximity, the listener should be able to compare the musical content from each work and be able to judge if one rises above the rest. I suspect that most listeners would find these works quite similar in content and worth. Therefore, with the music being equal, it's easy to conclude that we should lift up the composition that does not make use of disparaging racist tropes. We now see the evolution of the Lassus Trombone graphic, which was also the Fillmore logo. The left and earliest graphic is clearly dark skinned and evocative of a clown. As we go to the right, the graphics get progressively newer. In the far right, the most recent graphic, we see that the skin tone is changed, as are the hair, bulging eyes, and oversized lips. Perhaps this was Fisher trying to keep up with changing times. One can only speculate. My work to date is far from complete, but I believe I am on the right path to exhibiting the use of negative stereotypes by Fillmore and many other of his contemporaries, as well as rediscovering works that do not make use of them, such as Nathaniel Davis's trombone family. Through my research, I've concentrated on Davis's works, but perhaps many more works existed. I concentrated on Davis because he stands tall in that he did not use racist tropes and was also African American. Fillmore is a notable composer of that time for his prolific and high-quality body of works. There are likely many other works by composers that do not use such racist tropes, some of which might have been people of color. I can only assume that many of them have been lost to history because history tends to remember few composers. It is also safe to say that non-white composers from that time and place in history were and continue to be neglected. The interest in presenting this lecture stems from the desire to reverse that course. Indeed, there are other like-minded individuals. Yo writes that Gordon Cherry, retired principal trombonist of the Vancouver Symphony and owner of Cherry Classics, a publishing house, independently came to the same conclusion. Cherry contacted Yo in June 2020 about his realization that he could no longer, in good conscience, sell Lassus Trombone. In his second article about Lassus Trombone, Yo presents an open challenge for new arrangements of Davis's trombone family for trombone and piano. The challenge was successful. Aaron Hettinger has arranged Davis's trombone family for trombone solo and piano, and Joshua Hauser has arranged Mr. Trombonology for brass quintet, and there are more to come. All these new arrangements are available through Gordon Cherry, who, as a side note, also publishes many of my own works. I met him when I attended the Symphony Orchestra Academy of the Pacific in British Columbia. This was back in 2006 or so, 2005, somewhere around there. And he was the trombone teacher there. We got along great, and we've maintained contact since then. And more recently, he was the first person actually to publish any of my works. So I thank Gordon Cherry for his friendship with me, his association with me, and also now for having such a conscience as to ceasing his publication of Lassus Trombone. The year 2020 brought race relations in the U.S. to the forefront of the national conversation in a way that had not happened in my lifetime. This conversation was no longer limited to those whose lives are affected by it. People from all walks of life finally engaged in this conversation. The conversation sparks thought, debate, and movement. Yo's article was inspired in part by the events of 2020. This presentation was also inspired by the events of 2020 and Yo's writing, as well as my own life experiences as a person of color. It gives me great comfort to see that people like Aaron Hettinger have created tangible fruits in the efforts to move forward from our disturbing American past. Additionally, new groups dedicated to the advancement of marginalized groups are being formed in greater numbers. Some of our very own MSU students, Evan Siegel and Jasmine Piggott, have formed the Tuba Euphonium Social Justice Initiative with the mission of promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Tuba Euphonium community. Even the topic of this lecture would have been unthinkable in the not-so-distant past. I look forward to what the future may bring us.